Alright guys, why did we do a fiberglass roof for our tiny house? In our tiny house, we're using a lot of new techniques, a lot of different techniques than a lot of people would use to try and kind of experiment with some stuff and maybe advance the cause of tiny houses in a way. Fiberglass is a material that I've worked with before, and I've worked with plenty of composite materials at my work. And just to take a step back, remember a composite material is two different materials that when you combine them have emergent properties that are greater than each of their individual components. An example would be reinforced concrete. But anyway, our tiny house has some unique design considerations that a lot of tiny houses and a lot of houses don't have. We are very limited in our height because we're very close to the maximum road legal height, and so we don't want to be adding, a giant chimney and roofing material that goes up half an inch even. That's a space that I would rather have on a roof. We also don't have much space to the sides to have gutters and eaves troughs, and most asphalt roofs and most houses have what's called the rafters. They extend over the side of the house, and it's called a soffit and stuff like that. They extend past the side of the house to get water a bit further out. We do not have that ability. And the most critical design consideration that we have as well is that our slide out has a very, very slight grade towards the outside, but it's very slight, and so it to the human eye appears flat. And what that means is that under some circumstances we may have water pooling up there. Now I want you to imagine that if you have an asphalt roof, which is just little shingles, the shingles are oriented such that they cover each other from water. But if water actually sat in there, it would get underneath the shingles and into the wood and begin rotting it and begin leaking into the house. If you had a metal roofs, they also layer the metal usually so that water just goes over them. But all their little sheet metal screws have little gaskets in them. Once again, if water is actually allowed to sit in there, it will find a way in. Fiberglass is made out of the stuff we use is made out of glass cloth and then a polyester resin. Similar type of polyester to what you would find in many plastics, but it's unsaturated components. So you have an A and B and you mix them and they turn from a liquid into a solid. What that means is that when we spread this resin onto the glass and lay it down, it becomes a solid after a while. And when you do that over the whole roof, it is one giant piece of plastic basically. It's completely waterproof. It's like a swimming pool or a hot tub or a bathtub, which they often make out of fiberglass actually. So our roof, we have tested it. We've sprayed water and stuff up there. We went through several big rains. It does not leak a drop. It is completely waterproof, like a bathtub. And same with our main house roof, though that one is less of a concern because the curvature really sheds rain super well. We may have to do a couple of little adjustments just to make it that extra bit more like, it's waterproof, but we want to have a bit more margin of safety because you never know what type of weather will hit you. We kind of want to divert more water away from the slide out if possible, but we'll look into that in time. For now, the fiberglass really worked quite well for us. And if you have any sort of flat roof, you are not really going to be able to use shingle type roofing, and I don't believe metal roofing will work either, unless you physically weld the entire roof together. So something like fiberglass might be a good option for you. In our case, we ran into a couple of problems with doing the roof, and I really want to discuss that so that anybody who does this in the future can kind of see what we had to deal with. The one thing that I was initially planning on doing was to have giant pieces of the entire fiberglass mat run the entire length of the house. The advantage of that is that individual fibers of glass run the entire length of the house, and that means that entire fiber of glass, as the house moves around, gets stretched and pulled as the house moves and gives it a lot of strength. If we were just to cut the glass into a bunch of pieces, it would be strong, but there's actually only that length of glass fibers now interconnecting the house rather than a giant one. So you get a lot more strength by having a giant run of the cloth. But the problem we had is that the resin we bought, the consumer grade polyester resin, it was 3M Bondo polyester resin that we found. It has a cure time of 15 minutes. And so you can imagine that in 15 minutes to mix this stuff and soak up a piece of glass cloth with the resin and lay it down and then maybe brush some more on, you could probably only do a few square feet maximum at a time. And I was trying to do like 100 square feet maybe at a time. And so that wasn't going to work clearly. What ended up happening is that in between the seams of where I could do a section and then flip the material back and do a section, I was getting lots of air bubbles, and that is super unsightly and weakening the material because now it's separated from the wood. And so you'd either have to split your glass and accept less strength and do it as individual sections, which I would recommend, or somehow figure out a slower curing resin. Now, epoxy resin typically has, and I'm quite experienced with epoxy resin, it typically has a slower cure time, and you may consider that for your roofing resin. However, the thing you have to consider about epoxy resin in this application is that it is much less UV resistant than polyester resin. That's always what I've heard, at least, is that epoxy is quite UV sensitive, and so if you used epoxy resin, you would have to find a paint that is UV blocking and paint it right away, just to make sure that you have the full strength there out of your fiberglass roof in that case. So guys, how do you actually make a fiberglass roof? Number one is that what I would certainly recommend is to make sure that you have a nice clean surface to work on. The more dirt and oil and wax and any of that sort of stuff, similar to painting, that you have on there, the less the fiberglass is going to adhere to the surface. If you have anything that is particularly slippery and not porous, wood is probably fine. But if you have something like glue or metal exposed, the fiberglass will not bond very well to that. And so you'll have to sand it to rough up the surface so that it has something to mechanically adhere to. The actual process of putting fiberglass on is pretty simple, as with most composites. You have to have either like a kitchen scale or measuring cups and measure according to the instructions on the back of the box. You may consider doing a little test batch before to see how it works and how much working time you have. In general though, you'll need quite a few mixing cups because you need to have a mix ratio between your A and B component. So you'll have some mixing cups, stir sticks. You need something to spread the resin around and wet the cloth. The best technique that I found at the end of the day, and I made kind of a mess of the roof and I had to redo quite a few spots. The best technique I found for wetting out the cloth was to have like a bucket of resin, or a shallow bucket, and then to wet the cloth in that bucket and make sure that I had a bit of resin over all of the cloth and that it was saturated, and then just throw it on there, and then that seemed to work fine. The polyester resin also ate through nitrile gloves really quickly. So you'll have to bear that in mind. We were doubling up gloves usually, and it was still eating through rather quickly. You might find that you also need some rollers and spreading sticks. The rollers were nice for kind of flattening out the resin. What I tried initially, especially because I was trying to do such large sections, was I would like paint on a layer of of polyester resin onto the wood, and then put the glass on, and then paint another layer. That did not work very well. I tended to get lots of air bubbles right in the glass, which is super frustrating. Like the fiber clearly hadn't soaked in enough resin. It's kind of the opposite that worked better for me. Don't paint it onto the wood, paint it onto the glass itself, and then lay that down. Even if it's a big piece, you could probably figure out a way to do that, like pour some onto the glass and then spread it around, put that on the wood. That seemed to work really well. And so far it's holding up at least. You will probably end up finding that after you've done a whole job like this, that you'll have some areas that did not work well. Maybe you'll have some air bubbles, maybe you'll have some spots that just didn't adhere very well, or the resin started curing too quickly and so it didn't stick to the wood super well. What you do in that case is just remove any loose material, sand everything, because the resin dries really smooth, and so new resin will not stick to that old resin. Make sure you sand it off, and then you just put on a new piece just as normal. As a matter of fact, that's another great reason to choose fiberglass as a roofing material, is that it's very easy to repair. If you do have a problem, just sand it off and put a new piece on. It's really easy. Another thing to consider for prepping the roof to be ready for fiberglass, and this is something you need to consider at the beginning actually, is the fiberglass material. For me, an issue that I had was that it would not go around corners very well. Imagine you have a corner here. The fiberglass, because the glass is not very bendy, obviously. It would break if you bend it too much. It does not want to go and make a nice corner. It wants to make a rounded corner. And so I either had to have it unsticked from the roof and flat on the side, or stuck to the roof and then rounded on the side. And so that was a really big frustration. If you actually want it to go around a corner, you're going to have to round that corner substantially for the glass to actually make that turn nicely. I just really wanted to stop. We were watching the video that we were putting together, and I really forgot to mention an important thing for beginners to using resins. This is an issue with both epoxy and polyester resins. But when you mix them, and when you begin to, when you mix the A and B component, they go through an exothermic reaction, meaning they get hot. Now, this can become really dangerous because they can begin to get really, really hot. I've had them hit 200 degrees before. And they also begin to release toxic smoke and stuff. You can burn yourself, you can start a fire. This is really important. A really big factor as to overheating is how much resin you're using. If you're doing a little patch of resin, just like a tiny amount at the bottom of this cup, you're not going to overheat it. If you're using one of these like larger buckets that's like a quart that we had, that will overheat very, very quickly, and you need to get it out of there extremely fast if you want to have any reasonable work time. So I'm going to show you the tip here. Especially where you want a bit more work time, or you need to give yourself that extra time on a larger batch. So you're probably going to mix your resin in a cup like this. We have like 180 milliliters in here. And this cup, when you have it in here, if you have this sitting for like 10 minutes, your resin will probably start to overheat if it's polyester, at least the stuff we were using. This shape of the liquid has a lot of internal volume and very little external surface area. What you can do is take like a tray, which is kind of what I was using. I was using a larger one for wetting my fiberglass, but use a tray or something, dump it into there. And what you've done is that you have the same volume of fluid, but now much more surface area, meaning it can stay cooler. In conclusion, we're pretty happy with our choice to use a fiberglass roof. I just wish that we'd thought it out a bit better and had done a better job planning everything and more experimentation, because it ended up being one of the harder tasks that we've done on this tiny house. It was very stinky, the polyester resin. It has that very strong styrene smell, similar to model glue, if you guys have ever used that, or car bondo has the same smell. So that was quite gross. Make sure you have all of your PPE. It gave us lots of, like, when we would get it on our arm or something, it would really start to irritate you quite quickly. And so you want to have materials to clean up. You want to wear gloves. I would wear a long sleeve shirt. The glass is also extremely itchy, and I find this at my work as well. Fiberglass, especially when you cut it, becomes super itchy and gets in all of your clothes. It is really, really gross, both because of the fibers being really itchy and sharp, and because of the resins being kind of toxic, smelly, and annoying. So make sure that you have all of your PPE, and as a matter of fact, just in general, we try to talk about safety on this channel. Make sure you have all of your PPE. For resins like this, I would generally recommend at least gloves, long sleeve shirt. Make sure your skin doesn't get exposed to the resin. And depending on what you're doing, you would also seriously consider a respirator with VOC canisters and safety glasses as well. Safety glasses in particular, I would say, if you're working at angles where you might have anything dripping into your eyes. Our case, we're working on the ground, so I wasn't too concerned about it. Respirator, if you're working in any indoor environment, that styrene is just disgusting, that polyester resin. Epoxy resin is not too smelly. In our case, it was pretty smelly, but at least we were outdoors, and so the smell would get carried away. but when I've had to work with that stuff indoors, it is disgusting. So grab a respirator. How much did our fiberglass roof cost? I think that the total area that we ended up doing was something like 370 square feet, somewhere around there. And I think that the cost at the end of the day, I'm gonna guess, was probably around at the very minimum, I don't think this is realistic, maybe $1,000 to about $1,500 at max. I think $1,500 is probably a lot closer to what we actually spent to do this roof. If you guys have any questions about how we did our fiberglass roof, please comment below and we'll be sure to answer any questions. Alright guys, in this video, you got to see how we weatherproofed the roof of our house. In the next video, you're going to get to see how we waterproofed our walls of our house, because we did not use siding, we used paint. And you guys are going to get to see the whole process, the colors we used, and how we did it, and how it looked in the end, the most important part. So see you guys in the next video.